The year was 1968, and America was at war halfway around the world. In the jungles of Vietnam, young American soldiers fought a conflict that would define a generation. But beyond the battles and the politics, beyond the headlines and the protests, there was another war being fought. A war of the heart, waged in handwritten letters sent home across the Pacific Ocean.
These letters were lifelines, thin threads connecting sons to mothers, husbands to wives, and brothers to sisters. Written by candlelight in muddy foxholes on the backs of sea ration boxes, and during brief moments of peace between firefights. These letters carried the deepest fears, hopes, and humanity of young men far from home. Private First Class Michael Sullivan from Boston was 19 when he arrived in Vietnam in February 1968. His first letter home was full of bravado and excitement. He wrote to his mother, describing the green countryside and assuring her that everything would be fine. But as the weeks turned to months, his letters began to change. The excitement faded, replaced by homesickness and a longing for familiar things. He wrote about missing his mother's Sunday dinners, the sound of church bells in his neighborhood, and the way snow looked falling on Boston Common. Sergeant Tommy Rodriguez from East Los Angeles had been in Vietnam for 8 months when he penned a letter to his younger brother. In it, he tried to explain what it was like to carry the weight of responsibility for other men's lives. He was only 22, but the jungle had aged him years. He wrote about the friends he'd lost, the impossible decisions he had to make, and how he prayed every night that he would be strong enough to bring his men home safely. His letters home were filled with advice for his brother: to stay in school, to help their mother, and to remember that family was the most important thing in the world. Lieutenant James Washington from rural Mississippi wrote poetry in his letters home to his wife, Sarah. A college graduate and former English teacher, he found solace in words when the chaos of war became overwhelming. His letters described the beauty he still managed to see even in a war zone, the way morning mist rose from the Mekong Delta, the sound of children laughing in Vietnamese villages, and the incredible bonds formed between soldiers who depended on each other for survival. But his letters also revealed his struggles with the moral complexities of war, questioning whether they were making a difference, and wrestling with the knowledge that every day might be his last. These young men wrote about fear, but they rarely admitted it directly. Instead, they wrote about being careful, about watching out for each other, about looking forward to coming home. They didn't want to worry their families, so they filtered their experiences through a lens of forced optimism.
Hay wrote about funny incidents. The time Rodriguez's squad got lost and ended up sharing sea rations with a family of Vietnamese farmers, or when Sullivan's unit adopted a stray dog that somehow knew to stay quiet during enemy patrols.
But between the lines, families could read the truth. They could sense the weight their sons were carrying in the careful way they chose their words, in the things they didn't say, and in the subtle changes in their handwriting as stress and exhaustion took their toll. Mothers saved every letter, reading them over and over, looking for clues about their boys' well-being. Wives carried letters in their purses, pulling them out to read during lonely moments when the absence felt overwhelming. The mail call was sacred in Vietnam. When helicopters brought supplies to remote fire bases, nothing was more important than the mailbag. Soldiers would gather around as names were called, hoping to hear their own. Those who received letters would find a quiet spot to read them, savoring every word. Those who didn't would pretend it didn't matter, but their disappointment was visible to anyone who cared to look. Private David Chen from San Francisco wrote to his girlfriend Linda about the friends he'd made in his unit. He described how soldiers from different backgrounds, farm boys from Iowa, city kids from Detroit, college students from California, had formed an unbreakable brotherhood. Race, class, and regional differences disappeared in the face of shared danger and mutual dependence. He wrote about late-night conversations in bunkers, about sharing photographs of home, and about how they all looked out for each other like brothers. But the letters also carried darker truths. As the war dragged on and casualties mounted, the tone of the letters changed. Soldiers wrote about friends who wouldn't be coming home, about the randomness of survival, and about how guilt ate at them when they lived through battles that claimed others. They wrote about nightmares, about jumping at sudden sounds, and about how hard it was to reconcile the violence they witnessed with the values they'd been raised with. Corporal Anthony Russo from Brooklyn wrote to his father about the weight of his rifle. but he wasn't talking about its physical mass. He was describing the psychological burden of carrying a weapon, of being ready to take a life at any moment, and of the split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. His father, a World War II veteran, understood what his son couldn't quite articulate: the invisible wounds that war inflicts on young hearts and minds.
The letters from home were equally important. Mothers wrote about neighborhood news, about siblings' achievements, and about ordinary life continuing in their absence. Wives shared updates about jobs, friends, and dreams for the future. These letters brought the smell of home, sometimes literally, when mothers would spray perfume on the pages or slip pressed flowers between the sheets.
They carried news of births and deaths, graduations and marriages, the full spectrum of life continuing back home. Some of the most poignant letters were written by soldiers who sensed they might not make it home. These final letters, often kept sealed and given to trusted friends with instructions to mail them if the worst happened, were raw expressions of love and regret. In them, young men poured out their hearts to parents, wives, and children they might never see again. They wrote about their hopes for their families' futures, about lessons they wanted to pass on, and about how proud they were to have served alongside their fellow soldier. Specialist Robert Murphy from Chicago wrote such a letter to his 2-year-old daughter, knowing she wouldn't be able to read it for years. In it, he tried to explain why he was so far from home, what he was fighting for, and how much he loved her. He wrote about the man he hoped she would remember him as, not the scared young soldier he sometimes felt like, but the father who would have done anything to come home to her. The postal workers who handled these letters understood their sacred importance. They worked overtime to get mail to and from Vietnam as quickly as possible, knowing that these pieces of paper were lifelines for both soldiers and families. Letters were sometimes delayed by weather, combat operations, or the chaos of war, but they always found their way eventually, carrying love across continents and oceans. When soldiers finally returned home, many found it difficult to explain what they'd experienced to those who hadn't been there. The letters they'd written became important records, capturing not just the facts of their service, but the emotional journey they'd traveled. Some veterans couldn't read their own letters for years after returning home, the memories too painful to revisit. Others read them regularly, remembering not just the fear and hardship, but also the camaraderie, the moments of beauty, and the strength they discovered within themselves. The families who received these letters treasured them as sacred artifacts. They kept them in special boxes, read them on anniversaries and birthdays, and eventually passed them down to children and grandchildren. These letters became family history, windows into a pivotal moment in American life, when young men were asked to serve their country in a controversial war thousands of miles from home. For those soldiers who didn't make it home, their letters became final testimonies to their character, their love for family, and their sacrifice. The approximately 58,000 names on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial represent not just numbers, but individual stories, dreams cut short, and letters that would never be written. Their final letters home stand as monuments to their humanity, reminders that behind every casualty statistic was a young person with hope.
Ears, and people who loved them.
Today, many of these letters survive in family collections, military archives, and museums. They serve as powerful reminders of the human cost of war and the enduring bonds between those who serve and those who wait at home. They show us that even in the darkest circumstances, love finds a way to bridge any distance, and that the simple act of putting pen to paper can carry more healing power than any medicine. The Vietnam War may have ended decades ago, but the letters written by those young soldiers continue to speak to us. They remind us that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to keep going despite it. They show us that in the midst of unimaginable hardship, young men far from home found ways to express love, hope, and humanity. Most importantly, they prove that even war cannot destroy the fundamental human need to connect, to share our experiences, and to let those we love know that they matter. These letters home were more than just words on paper. They were acts of faith, bridges across impossible distances, and proof that love can survive anything, even war.